what we're doing with this brown bag seminar series is we're introducing our synthesis reports to the Trinity River Restoration Program community of scientists, and we're having a series of 6 of these sessions to go over our wait, did I say 6? Is it 6? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Sorry, 5. 5 sessions, and we will have a conclusion. That's why I was thinking 6. But we're going to have these 5 seminars, brown bag sessions, and each one of them has a topic which you've seen on the flyer. And after we're done, program scientists are going to reconvene, and we're going to talk about how we're going to use this information in the context of adaptive management. And all of these presentations have a report, a written report. Not all of them are complete. Some of them are incomplete, but they eventually will have a report. So you'll have a report. You'll have these presentations, which are going to be recorded to refer to. We're going to have a question and answer session at the end of each session, so that you can talk to the presenters, ask them questions or give them comments. And that is, I'd like to point out, that's sort of an informal peer review, depending on who's asking the questions and what the responses are. But especially for the reports that are in progress, this is a good way to provide a little informal feedback, peer review type feedback to the report authors. So today we're going to be, we have the physical session, and we have Todd Buxton presenting the fine sediment synthesis report. We have Tim Caldwell and Scott McBain presenting sediment storage. We're going to have Todd Buxton come back on, and he's going to talk about the tributary delta synthesis. And then we're going to wrap it up with the channel complexity synthesis report, which is still in production right now. And that presentation will be done by Justin Alvarez. So first off, Todd Buxton is a physical scientist in the Trinity River Restoration Program office. He started several years ago working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, but at the Trinity River Restoration Program office. And he produced this fine sediment synthesis report in collaboration with co-authors, which he'll credit, I'm sure, at the beginning of his presentation. But he produced a lot of pretty potentially far-reaching recommendations that have the potential to really change how we manage the Trinity River. And so I encourage you, as with all the presenters, to pay close attention to the recommendations. After all of the presentations are done for the day, we'll have at roughly 2:30 or so, we'll have a question and answer session so that you can talk to the authors about any questions that you have. We're going to screen or sort of moderate the questions and answers. The intended audience for these presentations are Trinity River Restoration Program scientists. So the information may be pretty technical, and because of that, we're going to prioritize questions from program scientists. If there's time left over and you have general questions, we'll absolutely try to get those questions addressed. But for the most part, these presentations will be really technical and will be directed at program scientists. So without any further delay, I'd just like to thank you all again for attending, and I'd like to turn the podium over to Dr. Todd Buxton, and he'll kick off the session with the fine sediment synthesis report. So Todd, go ahead and get going whenever you want to. I'm going to turn off my camera.
Okay, thanks, James. I'll go ahead and share my screen. So this is James's Fine Sediment Synthesis Report. And this project began, I don't know, 3 years ago or something. And I initially had, I think, 3 or 4 co-authors, and all of them took different jobs. I was left to actually write this thing myself, do all the analysis myself. So this is actually just on me. There's a reference for the paper. If you want a TRRP's data port, you can find this and download it and read it if you want. I'll give an overview of it here today. By no means will I present everything that's in there because there's a lot in there. So populations on the Trinity River is like porridge to Goldilocks. There can be too little porridge, not enough in the bed or on the surface of the bed or on the floodplains, or there can be just the right amount, and then there can be too much. And the Trinity River has areas that have gone through all these different states. I won't read these lists to you. You can look over yourself, but just a few highlights is when there's too little porridge or fines, and fine sediments on the Trinity River are defined as sediments that are less than or equal to 8 millimeters in diameter. Anything larger than that is considered coarse grains. And then there's sand that's defined as grains less than or equal to 2 millimeters in diameter, just so get some definitions out of the way. But when there's too little fines, a notable effect is bedload transport can be suppressed. There can also be reduced meandering of the channel because the fines aren't available to deposit on the inside of bends and promote riparian plant growth and roughness on the inside of bends, which then forces the river to migrate in the opposite direction. When fines are just beneficially present, the river is kind of humming like a well-oiled machine. And so there's benefits to the bed surface mobility. And then also there's sufficient turbidity during elevated flows to provide cover for juvenile salmonids, and a couple other benefits, actually a lot of other benefits. Then there's damaging effects that occur when fines are overly abundant. And we've seen this on the Trinity River where the fines can actually fill in the gravel interstitial spaces in the bed and pool on the bed surface and create a sand bed channel from what used to be a gravel bed channel. So that's where I'll start. I'm going to give you a quick history on fines in the river. So in just the last couple of 100 years, we've gone from a state where the Trinity River was amazingly damaged. Like, what more can you do to this poor river? First, there was the hydraulic mining that washed sediments from the hillsides and tributaries down into the main stem valley. And once they got there, the dredgers moved in and striated all those sediments into mounds and removed the gold as best they could. And in the meantime, there was logging and roads being constructed in the tributaries, which especially in Grass Valley Creek and Rush Creek and a couple others, destabilized those granitic soils, which then contributed masses of material downstream into the river valley. In some places, the river aggraded as many as 5 or so meters, the average being around a meter of aggradation in the upper portion of the restoration reach, lasting all the way, and that's from Lewiston Dam, lasting all the way down to around the North Fork, with most of the aggradation from Oregon Gulch upstream. So that after the bulk of that damage occurred, we still had a natural hydrograph to the river, and the river started to heal itself. So you can see on the left, this is the Trinity River at Junction City in 1944. You got all the striated mounds from the dredgers and a braided system because of the overabundance of sediments. But then the river had a couple decades of high flows to work on these mounds of excess sediment. You can see where I've circled here, the mounds are starting to be mobilized and dispersed into bars, and a more natural meandering channel is starting to form. So there was hope. It was healing itself until these things were built. Trinity Dam closure occurred in November 1960, and that's when the floods, natural flooding was curtailed. And then Lewiston Dam was completed and flow diversions began in April 1963. And that's when you can see the flow volume released to the main stem river went from what's on the left of this figure to the right. Just essentially a very downscaled hydrology to this gravel bed stream. So what happened then is the tribs kept providing the sediments they always have to the river, but there was no water to move the sediments downstream, so they accumulated, transformed the gravel bed river to a sand bed stream, especially up in the Lewiston area, and the pools in the main stem river filled with fine sediment. And then along with that, flood suppression came encroachment of riparian vegetation. You can see in 1960 at Dark Gulch, you got a nice big old gravel bar. It's open. It's been mobilized frequently enough to disallow the riparian vegetation to encroach on the channel. But by 5 years later, that riparian vegetation was pretty happy growing right next to the base flow channel and maturing, so locking the river in place. So there was immediate impacts to the salmon populations, and folks noticed that. So they started devising ways to try to reverse those impacts. And some of the approaches worked really well, but some didn't really work much at all or had short-lasting effects. Used bulldozers to tear up the riverbed to get the fines to flush from the cemented gravels. Also this riffle sifter, basically push a jet of water into the bed to flush the fine sediments out. Then they also tried to dredge pools with heavy machinery or pumps, and then even tried to create riffles for habitat, and you can see that down here. None of these really had any lasting effects. But what did seem to make a big difference was building the Hamilton ponds and Wellet ponds at the outlet of Grass Valley Creek, which was one of the largest contributors of fine sediment to the river. And notably the watershed restoration that occurred in Grass Valley Creek and other creeks like Rush and Indian Creek, stabilized road systems or just put them to bed. Reduce the hill slope failures so that the sediments weren't mass disturbing into the waterways. But I think most notably, and it's hard to allocate the decrease in fines to one factor more so than another, but it seems that the main stem flow increases that occurred through different regulatory periods in the post-dam Trinity River seems most responsible for the channel beds restoration. So we can see that in these repeat photos where near Society Pool at River Mile 101.7, you can see this sandy streaky bed was returned to more of a gravel bed situation. Here's Scott McBain standing on Holy Gulch Delta, which is composed entirely of fines. Now we have spring flow releases that mobilize those fines downstream. And then you can see also at Rio Stop Pool, this is a river mile 102.5. What used to be nearly full of fines is now this great big deep monster that holding adults salmon really appreciate. So visually, we've done a really good job of restoring a gravel bed channel in the Trinity River. But photos aren't necessarily what you can base management decisions on. Instead, data is including sediment production from tributaries and then main stem river processes like entrainment thresholds and hiding effect analysis. Annual loads of encouragement sediment are calculated. Hysteresis and fine sediment are for restoring biological and physical functioning to the Trinity River that are promoted by fine sediments. So the ones that I was able to address in the report are
Hey Todd, we lost you real quick. Maybe turn off your video on there so you save some of your bandwidth.
okay. Okay, so not sure where you lost me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Todd.
Can you hear me now?
We've got you, Todd.
Okay. So these are the fine sediment targets. Sorry. So these are the fine sediment targets that are analyzed in the report. The red ones, ones highlighted red, are the ones that actually have data to address. The black ones are as important, but we lack data for assessing this talk on the red highlighted ones. And so first we'll go to fine sediment targets for the sediment stored in the stream bed. The target for fines less than or equal to 2 millimeters, so sand actually in subsurface areas of the stream bed, is that these materials compose less than 15% in bulk samples in spawning areas. And the result for that target is shown down here in the table that I'm squirreling around on. So the missed targets are shaded. So in the case of target for spawning that I just mentioned, and macroinvertebrates, which is that the fines compose less than 30% in these same samples and these ripples, runs, and glides in the channel, the target was made all the way down to Indian Creek in 2018. Same thing in 2014, except at Poker Bar. And then in 2009, the entire river met the target where samples were taken. In 2019, notably in Lewiston, the target was missed. And this was because the car fire puked out a bunch of fine sediments the Deadwood Creek Delta, and those sat in the river for all winter and then were just barely dispersed downstream and percolated into the bed. And so the target was missed, and we'll talk more about that later. But as you can see here, the subsurface portion of the stream bed is actually very healthy in the upper restoration reach, and that is from Lewiston down to around Steel Bridge. Now calculations of Chinook egg to fry survival using an equation by Tapple and Bourne. The target of greater or equal to 80% survival has been met in the last, well, since 2018, and you can see how it's a little splotchy in 2014. So we're having high predicted survival of salmon egg incubation to emergence. So we've got a healthy channel bed for salmon and macroinvertebrates for the most part, especially again in that upper restoration area. This next target has to do with sand seals that can form or not in salmon reds. Sand seals are a veneer of sediment that can form in the upper portion of reds and block sediment from infiltrating down into the red and suffocating eggs. At the threshold of the normalized suspended sediment load by discharge, when that's greater or equal to 0.05 tons per CFS, egg incubation period, you can actually start to see reds filling with fines and suffocating or entombing the embryos. And so the calculation was made for the egg incubation period using measured suspended sediment concentrations during the spring flow release. It's the only data we had for this calculation. We considered hysteresis in the calculation, and the result was that in no year since 2006 the measurements were made that's been in the Lewiston area filling with fine sediments and suffocating eggs and reds. But in Limekiln Gulch is a similar result, except in 2006 and 2017, the concentrations of suspended sediment were enough to potentially cause this suffocation. And then we see down in the Douglas City area, you start to see some frequent entombment, potentially, of eggs in red. So that will come out in the recommendations as we get to the end of this presentation. Then turbidity is another thing. So turbidity, some folks might think is a bad thing because it's a cloudy water. It's not as pretty, but it's actually very functional for fish in the river. It provides the juveniles cover and the adults too. There's a lot of other considerations for turbidity. I'll leave it at that for now, but the data is somewhat limited on turbidity in the Trinity River, except at Limekiln Gulch. This column here is the percentage of time during the juvenile rearing period that we had data for this analysis. And then the right column is the percentage of that time that the target was actually met. So you can see that the target was actually only missed in a couple years for turbidity, and that was at Limekiln Gulch in the early 2000s. So we're doing really good with turbidity. There's not a lot of suspended size sediments in the river. And so further support for that is, you can see this curve here shows the suspended loads in tons per day in 1981 to 1992 during tributary flow events. And then during Lewiston Dam releases in that same period, you had a slightly lower daily loads, but then in the rod flow period, 2006 to 2019, we see the loads decreasing quite markedly. So a lot less suspended sediments available for transport in the river. Also, you can see the same thing here where the loads normalized by drainage area and flow are a heck of a lot lower in more recent years than they have been in the past. So less fine sediments available for transport, lower turbidity. Z-score is Newcomb and Jensen's model for predicting the effects of suspended sediments on different life stages of fish. Here we consider juvenile salmonids and adult salmonids. Try to skip some of the details here so we can make some progress. I think I'm running over time. But the take home is that there is few enough suspended sediments available for transport that we see very little impacts to either life stage of these fishes. And then coarse sediment mobility. Fine sediment increases coarse sediment mobility in a number of different ways. I'll spare you the details, but the more fines research has found, the more mobile the bed. So you don't want an overly mobile bed because you might start to see scour effects on salmon egg incubations. You don't want too little fines, or else you're starting to see a overstabilized bed. And bed mobility is a good thing for cleansing the hyperetic zone in a number of different reasons. So the Woolman pebble counts have been used for stress partitioning calculations and other things at the sediment transport monitoring stations. And Woolman counts aren't efficient at documenting fines. I considered them anyway, and no year has the amount of fines detected and the Woolman counts met the target for the amount of fines needed to promote bed mobility. And the same thing for, or similar thing for bulk surface samples. So those are masses of sediment that are taken from the active layer of the bed, which is a certain top depth of the stream bed. And then the material below that is the subsurface material. And so if you get enough fines in either of these domains, you can start to see more or less bedload transport. And you can see that there's too few fines in most locations in most years to promote bed mobility at rates that I think we'd like to see on the river. We spend a lot of water to move coarse sediment. We may be able to spend less water moving those same sediments if more fines were in the river. So with those targets, this is where the porridge is cold just right or hot based on how the targets have been met or not met. And it's very clear in the data that Lewiston Dam to Rush Creek is severely lacking in fines, and there's evidence that shortage extends mostly down to Douglas City, excepting some reaches where it seems like the fine sediment content might be just about right, which is in the Limekiln Reach and below Douglas City. There's a relatively little data below Douglas City though, so that would require more analysis. And then it's hard, given the available data, to find any area in the Trinity River where fine sediments are overly present. So there mostly appears a deficit or just right. More information is needed to see if we can find some areas of hot porridge. But the river is in much better shape with regards to fine sediment for the most part, except that there is some areas that are lacking fines, and there's recommendations to address that. So major findings of this paper is that the abundance of fines has been ameliorated by those restoration actions I mentioned before. There's a strong deficit in fines between Lewiston Dam and Rush Creek. and it may extend as far down as Douglas City, excepting Lime Kiln area. The fine sediment targets for biological populations are overwhelmingly met where data are available, but the targets for coarse sediment transport are rarely met. That has occurred since around the start of the flow, rod flow releases. Now, currently, we don't have funding for a physical program to do any sediment monitoring on the Trinity River. So that is needed to adaptively implement the sediment additions to the river that I'm going to recommend next. And also there appears to exist a dysfunction in the site-specific transport and storage of sediment in the restoration reach of the river. And that could be because short, moderate spring flow peaks that are the spring flow releases that we're allowed to make are mistimed with creek flows for routing and sorting tributary sediments. And you can see here, this is Deadwood Creek after the Carr fire. And this is a picture of that same location after the spring flow release. So Deadwood Creek pukes out all the sediment. It sits there until spring when the high flows disperse it. But the effect in between is that you cap the stream or the riverbed with mud, and that certainly doesn't aid salmon incubation in the gravel bed channel. So my recommendations are release flows in winter for sediment routing and salmon protection. We also need to add fine sediment to the channel between Lewis and down Rush Creek. And in order to do that, we need to refine the Trinity River TMDL to allow addition of fines and higher turbidity during those additions and also during channel reconstruction, which has a turbidity limit of only 20 NTUs now. We also need to fund sediment transport and storage monitoring in the Trinity River. And I argue that we should no longer cease dredging Hamilton ponds at Grass Valley Creek. The river needs those fines instead, and we should allow them to transport through. And then I think there is a need to reevaluate whether Buckhorn Dam is necessary. It blocks a major tributary for any type of anadromous salmon use. And we've been out there this the last couple of weeks, and with the extremely low reservoir, you can see that it really hasn't captured very much sediment at all in the 30 years or so since it's been in place. So that's all I have. Any questions until the end?
We've got like a couple minutes for questions if anyone has one. And you can use the raise hand feature or type it in the chat.
Seth has a question.
Seth, you got a question?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Sweet. One question I had was about the entombment metric. Kind of like it was like the frequency was not met, I guess. Well, turbidity was often met, like the metric for turbidity was often met, and fine sediment is going down over time, but the entombment metric seemed to be not reflecting that. So it seemed like we violated that one more, despite the kind of low amount of, or reduced amount of fine sediment. Can you talk about that a little bit, or give me your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Suspended sediment is bowls that are then 0.5 millimeter, and that some of those larger particles that transport in suspension contribute comparatively less to turbidity, which is the light scattering properties of sediment. This is something that I would seek input from, I think Smokey's on, maybe could weigh in on this as well. So my understanding is that the high suspended sediment loads don't necessarily associate with high turbidity, because the suspended sediment includes the size particles that don't contribute as much to those light scattering properties in the flow. And so you have a disparity in those two metrics.
Okay, I think I understand that. And then I guess a kind of a related question is this, you know, the whole idea of the mismatch of, you know, flows out of the dam and tributary flows that you mentioned in other parts of your presentation. So I guess that makes me wonder if would you expect to see an improvement in this particular metric if we were able to synchronize some of those flows?
You mean an improvement in the sand seal metric?
Yes, reduction in the yes.
I think so, because you would be dispersing those delta sediments in winter, and so the amount of water for the normalization would increase, and so your concentration would lower. So yes, I think that you would see much less capacity or probability for entombment of eggs and reds if you're transporting the same amount of sediment as let's over a longer time period with more flow.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hey, Aaron, I see your message about not seeing the raise your hand, but we're gonna have to move on. So we ran out of time. So just hold on to it till the end, and if we have time at the end, we can address it then. So I want to keep on moving. Our next speaker is from McBain and Associates, introducing the synthesis report related to sediment storage. So we've got Scott McBain and Andrea on. I'm not sure who's going to end up presenting, but one of them will. So go ahead.
Great. Can you guys hear us okay?
Yep.
And I got to share my screen here. Hold on. So I need to get permission from somebody, either Chris or James.
You have permission now. Sorry about that.
All right. All right, is that working?
We can see the whole presentation, like we can see your screen.
Looks good.
There
All
you
right, awesome. So unfortunately, Tim's not available today. He's had to go to a tribal council meeting. So you've got myself, and then Andrea Hamilton will be helping me out a little bit as we go. A little bit of background that this is kind of an overview. A lot of this is an overview of work that we did in 2014 and 15, and kind of summarizes more recent updates in 2018 and 19. And a little bit of background on why we did this and why we're doing this is that the Trinity Flow Evaluation Study adopted a strategy of a scaled down dynamic alluvial river as kind of the foundation for river rehabilitation and fishery recovery, and had objectives of increasing coarse sediment storage, or gravels and cobbles, and then maintaining that over time with a gravel augmentation program and downstream distribution of tributary sediments. The problem that we made, I guess, back in the day when we wrote these objectives is that we were never quantitative about, well, how much storage do we want? What are some quantitative targets? And we've always kind of struggled with that over the years since the flow study was completed. So this work was really trying to help the program identify some potential core sediment storage targets that we could then use as metrics for evaluating progress towards this scaled down dynamic alluvial river. So the objectives to try to do that is that we wanted to map what was out there. So it's kind of objective one. We wanted to better understand the formative mechanisms of why those bars were out there, the ones that we saw, so relate to the formative mechanisms. And then my primary objective is to start a discussion about potential targets for different reaches. And as everybody knows intuitively, there's a lot of diversity in channel morphology as you go down the restoration reach, from more confined canyons to more broader alluvial plains and different impacts in each of those. So you can't really have a one size fits all target for core sediment storage. And then once we can start talking about what some of those targets may be, is to develop management options to meet those targets. So that was kind of objective 4. And then one that we also wanted to do is to investigate relationships between active bar area and fish habitat. So what is active bar area? So we talked about, we can't really measure storage very well in the field because to get storage, you need width, depth, and length. And I think we can get width and depth or width and length pretty easily, but how deep do you need to, what is your assumption for storage for a bar? So to kind of work around that problem of what is the bottom of an active bar is that we just used active bar area above the 450 CFS water edge at the end of summer so that there's very little tributary accretion and that there's consistency in that edge from year to year as a basis for it. So the lower edge, again, would be based on 450 CFS water elevation, but how do we do the backside of the bar? And using the term active bar, we're not trying to quantify, Pleistocene era bars or dredge tailings or anything like that. It's active bars that the current post-rod flow regime is actively manipulating and transporting and forming as part of this, again, scaled down dynamic alluvial river under the post-rod flow regime. So that was really the hard part of this exercise, is defining the backside of that active bar. And so this is an easier one, but we had a number of criteria to define what that is: imbrication of the rocks, vegetation, like we see here with this red line. And we were able to do this, I think, in a fairly repeatable way back in 2014. And yes, we mapped this over the entire 40 miles of the river, assigned a formative feature to those bars. We were also looking for large wood that may be a formative feature for this. So we mapped large number of pieces as we went down. We took ground photos of every bar. And then the metric that we used was active bar area. So the area, meters squared per 1,000 meter length of channel. So it's really getting at an active bar density. So if I colloquially will switch over to active bar density, that's what it means, is square meters per 1,000 meter length of channel. And so we wanted to look at these mapping results, longitudinally, cumulatively, and then in unit areas. So this kind of density issue. And then we looked at a lot of different variables for exploring some of these relationships. Some of these were done in the 2014-15 analysis, and I kind of went over a lot of those. And then more recently in the 2018-19 through 21 analysis, we did some more work on looking at relationships between active bar area and fry and pre-smolt habitat at a variety of different spatial scales that Andrea will talk about in a little bit more. We also looked at some other metrics, the SAB's channel complexity metric, foot-eel-legged frog egg mass habitat, red distribution, some other things too, but just in the name of time, we won't go over any of that. So here's the results of the cumulative curve for active bar area, where Lewiston Dam is on the lower left and North Fork Trinity River is on the right. And so it just shows these inflection points where you get bars, you get vertical rises in active bar area, and it shows the different subreaches that we defined at the time and the tributary deltas or tributary confluences. So you can see some, where you get flatness in the curve is kind of low storage. When you have a steep curve is where you're getting a lot of bars. But still this longitudinal curve isn't all that intuitive. So we can transform this into looking at active bar storage per 200 meter Gertz panel. So on the x-axis is the distance downstream from Lewiston Dam based on the Gertz panels. Actually, this is river kilometer. And these little blue lines here is active bar storage at individual bars. So you can see there's a lot of variability in storage. And then in the reaches, we average the active bar storage for each of these subreaches. And with this, when we do this, it kind of becomes apparent where certain subreaches have higher storage and certain subreaches have much lower storage. And so again, the green text up here shows the subreach active storage density. So like, for example, from the dam down to downstream to the Rush Creek Delta, it's like 2,700 square meters per 1,000 meters. The density, the Rush Creek Delta subunit or subreach has nothing in it. Whereas the Indian Creek Delta subreach has like 6,500 square meters per 1,000 meters. So that's the highest density, which is the line up in here. But you see other reaches have really low densities. So this is the Grass Valley Creek to Indian Creek reach, subreach. And then these are still pretty low down in here, downstream of Weaver Creek and in the Browns Creek Canyon in reaches 7 and 8. And then higher densities down in reach 9. So that kind of gives you an idea of this active bar density to give you a snapshot of where there's decent storage and where there's not so much. Just in the name of time, I'm just going to skip this, but we did look at formative features for these bars. And kind of an overview of the results from this is that subreaches 1, 3, and 9, which is up by Lewiston, below Rush Creek, and below Oregon Gulch have the highest active bar area, and that the subreaches 1 and 3 are likely higher due to the historic gravel augmentation, because that's where it's mostly been, with the exception of rehab projects that have also added material. And subreach 9 had a lot of remnant storage from the 1997 flood. If y'all remember, back in the day, in 97, it was large enough down below Canyon Creek where it actually was taking out the riparian berm and recreating meanders down there, because it was over like 24,000 CFS down there. And subreaches 2 and 4 had the lowest active bar area. Subreach 2 is the Rush Creek Delta, so that doesn't really count, but subreach 4 is the canyon between Grass Valley Creek and Indian Creek. And subreach 4 has had no gravel augmentation other than the material that's routed down from Loudon Meadows gravel augmentation site. So probably just the upper end of subreach 4 has had some effect on gravel augmentation, but the vast majority of it has had little to none. And Hamilton Ponds, as Todd mentioned, we're not getting any coarse sediment from the Grass Valley Creek either since creation of Hamilton Ponds. And just as an example, subreach 4 that I'm kind of focusing on here has like half the bar area density of subreach 6 and 7, which is down in the Browns Creek Canyon and Weaver Creek area, in a similar geomorphic setting with kind of valley confinement and slope. So this kind of gave us some thoughts of like, well, can we use the amount of storage that's in subreach 6 and 7 as like a minimum potential future storage for subreach 4, again, with the objective of trying to think through where we can get some targets looking into the future. So yeah, I think I'll just kind of keep moving forward. So one of the other things that we did back in 2014-15 was this is at the beginning of the SRH2D habitat modeling. And at that time we had, I think, as an 8-mile subreach that was done, very preliminary data. And we related active bar area on the y-axis here at different flows with fry habitat and pre-smolt habitat, and at 450 CFS and at 830 and 1050 and then 1550. And you can see the effect of the dip in the curve here as flows increase, both habitats go down. But one of the things that we saw here is that the habitat is actually more, even though it's going down, it is resilient around those active bar areas. So you can see at the higher flows that those bars are still having a hydraulic effect, or at least the model is predicting that it's having a hydraulic effect that's creating habitat, even though it's still lower. But in these other areas that have no active bar areas, there's virtually no habitat. So this model's been updated, as everybody knows. And so we really wanted to, as part of this next phase of the work, is to do more work on looking at habitat quantity and active bar area to help us inform desired future conditions for gravel, for active bar area and gravel storage. If this thing's in everybody's way or not, I'm going to move it over here. Okay. So, and Andrea's going to take this over here in just a second, but so what we did here is we wanted to, in 2018 and 19, we had the updated SRH 2D model with habitat area as defined then, where we looked at river-wide fry and pre-smolt habitat and related that to active bars. And we used depth and velocity suitability to define habitat area as part of this analysis. And again, we also looked at field-legged frog and a few other metrics, but we focused on the flows in the 375 to 2000 CFS range to really kind of focus in that dip in the habitat curve. And so the key results from these two analyses, we looked at relationships between active bar area and fry and pre-smolt at 1,000-meter sections. So we combined 5 consecutive 200-meter Gertz panels. And then we also did some more lumping. So we did a lot of different combinations of Gertz panel reach lengths and doing this analysis. And we found that 1,000-meter pieces worked well as even more lumping together at the subreach level. Oops. So the subreach level, just as a reminder of the boundaries, I should have done this at the very beginning, but here's the 9 subreaches that we developed back in 2014. And these breaks, and unfortunately there's 153,000 different geomorphic subreaches that the Trinity program is using, and this is another one. These were developed initially by our gravel mapping team based on what they were seeing in the field from differences in active bar areas that they mapped. And a lot of that correlated with tributary junctions like Rush Creek and Grass Valley Creek and Indian Creek, but then others sections that don't make as much sense in hindsight, or like the Rush Creek backwater, just because there was no sediment storage there. And then the Indian Creek Delta, which has the highest storage area that was actually called out. Those are unique, unusual reaches. So I just want to kind of flag those as not outliers, but unique reaches that you just have to take this with a little bit of grain of salt. And so Andrea's going to then talk about some of the habitat analysis, first talking about the 1,000-meter groupings and then looking at the subreaches. So Andrea, you can just say next when you want me to go to the next slide.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah, so as Scott mentioned, the first analysis that we are presenting here is the analysis where we looked at fish habitat versus active bar area for the entire reach at the 1,000-meter Gertz panel resolution. And for this analysis, we actually ran 10 different regressions. We ran one for each of the 5 stream flows for both of the life stages. And this chart here, we are presenting all 10 of the regressions that we ran. And what we found was that all the regressions and the relationships between and all the regressions were significant and had a positive relationship between fish habitat and active bar area, and that the relationships seem to be the most robust at the 750 CFS and the 1050 CFS. And we think that this is potentially because this is the point at which the inundation levels on bars are starting to increase habitat. Next, please. So this chart here, what we did is we took the slopes of those regression lines and we plotted them against the stream flow to look at how the relationship between the rate of increase in fish habitat and active bar area changes as stream flow increases. And as you can see in this chart, the rate of increase is the lowest at the lower flows and is at the highest at the 750 CFS, the 1050 CFS. And then as we get into the higher flows, the rate of increase starts to go down again. And what we think is happening here is we think at these low flows, these gravel bars are just minimally inundated. So the relationship is very low. And then when we get into the 750 and 1050 CFS, we think these gravel bars are becoming inundated with water at a point where depth and velocities are within a high suitability range for the fry and pre-smolt life stages. And then as the flows increase, these gravel bars start to become drowned out and the depth and velocity start to move out of that suitability range. Next, please.
Yeah, just one last thing here too on this chart. What it is also showing is if we're really trying to address the dip in the curve is that the amount of potential benefit from a fish habitat perspective via adding active bars would be greatest in that 750 to 1050 CFS range. So it's kind of a nice sweet spot for addressing that dip in the curve issue that we've been trying to address over time. That's where we get our most benefit.
Right, exactly. So the next analysis that we ran was we did essentially the same type of regression, but we did it at the sub-reach scale. So we looked at fish habitat against active bar area for the 1,000-meter grits panel resolution, but for each sub-reach, we used the grits panels that were within those sub-reaches. And so just to kind of a note here, we did not do a regression analysis on sub-reach 2 and sub-reach 5 because they didn't have enough grits panels to do a robust regression. So for reach 2 had like 2 grits panels and reach 5 had 1 of the 1,000-meter resolution. So what we then did, so overall there was like 10 regressions per sub-reach. So it's quite a bit of regressions. And so what we did is we again plotted the slopes against stream flow for both fry and pre-smolts. And in this figure on the lower right is for fry, but the pre-smolt figure is very similar. But as you can see here, the characteristics of the curves are very similar to what we were seeing at the reach level, in that the rate of change is the lowest at the lower stream flows and then seems to be maximized at this kind of sweet spot at the 750 and the 1050 CFS. However, we did have like a 2 kind of weird outlier sub-reaches, reach 4 and 8. And they seem to have like an opposite relationship, an opposite trend, and actually had like a decrease, a negative slope between fish habitat and active bar area. We found that, and then the relationship became positive again at 2000 CFS. We don't really exactly know what's happening there, but we have some ideas. We think that potentially in reach 8, the gravel bars are bigger and they're at a higher elevation. And so they're probably not even really getting inundated, or at least inundated in a way that's meaningful for habitat at 2000 until 2000 CFS. And then for sub-reach 4, I mean, as Scott mentioned, it had like the lowest densities of gravel. So we think that could potentially be an issue here as well.
Anything else, Andrea, or do you want me to take this one on?
No, yes, and pass it back on to you, Scott.
Okay. So I'm kind of going into the home stretch on some wrap up stuff here since we're running out of time. But I guess the recommendations that we're making currently in this report we've identified some potential targets for future active bar area based on kind of our geomorphic assessment of what's out there now and what we think could exist there. So for example, subreach 4 from Grass Valley Creek to Indian Creek, we kind of flagged this because it has the lowest active bar density with the exception of the Rush Creek backwater, which we'll just kind of discount. And we've virtually had very little gravel augmentation that's occurred in that reach. And we said, well, how much can we actually increase that that's reasonable given the geomorphic setting for that? So we looked at reach 6 and 7, which is below Weaver Creek and Browns Creek Canyon. And those are currently in the 1,100 to 1,300 square meters per 1,000 meter length. And so we said, well, it's a similar geomorphic setting. We should at least be able to do that. So kind of at a lower limit, we're recommending that we should try to shoot for at least 1,100 square meters per 1,000 meters. And we should be able to do more than that. So a little bit higher range. And then in subreaches 6 and 7, while they're not as low as reach 4, they're still pretty low compared to other reaches. So we kind of left the lower limit as currently existing, but we think that we can at least double the active bar density there reasonably well before, we can't do too much there. And that we can, and then in subreach 8, which is from below Dutch Creek, it's also very low. So it seems like, because that's a more alluvial section, we've got more space, we should be able to increase that much more, similar to what we're seeing in subreach 9. So that's kind of where that number came from. And so this is kind of what it looks like. If you look at those existing storage ranges to what those potential recommended storage ranges could be, is these orange shadings here. So just graphically. But this isn't necessarily meaning that we have to have hordes of dump trucks or helicopters to try to do this. There's a number of different mechanisms. So this gets into the other objective here of like, how can we start making some progress on this? So in some reaches where we have good access, we can do gravel augmentation, particularly in the upper river. There's ability to increase roughness features in places that are less accessible. So adding large wood to create hydraulic shielding areas that both trap coarse sediment as well as retain it over time as lead deposits or backwater deposits. But then other downstream reaches, like in subreach 8, where we're really low, it's, as everybody knows, we're doing a major rehabilitation of that reach right now. And so just with that effort, we should see a substantial increase in active bar storage down there associated with those rehab projects. So this may already be happening in subreach A, so it'll be really interesting to see how that reach evolves compared to some of the targets, the existing conditions in the targets that we've identified. So one of the other things that I wanted to do is just show people, like when we talk about what these storage numbers are, what does this mean? Because they're kind of abstract if you say, 1,100 square meters per 1,000 meters. So what does this look like on the ground? So like in subreach 4, this is on the upstream end of Poker Bar access, and these are the 200-meter Gertz panels. You can see many of these reaches have 0 storage, active bar storage. This reach here has a little tinge here on this kind of pathetic little point bar on the inside of the bend. And even that little piece there has 600 square meters per 1,000 meters. So while these numbers seem pretty big as far as targets, they're still fairly modest when you actually see it on the ground. A better example is down in the Browns Canyon reach, where you can see some of the mapped areas here, these 2 little bars here. And some of the highest storage is showing in here, like 5,000 square meters per 1,000 meters. When you start looking at these kinds of bars, to me as a geomorphologist, these don't look unreasonable for desired future conditions in the Trinity. So when we start throwing numbers around, in these potential targets of 1,300 to 2,700 square meters per 1,000 meters, this looks fairly achievable to me personally, and isn't necessarily too onerous of a future target. But we haven't really spent a whole lot of time working with the physical work group to kind of sharpen our pencil on this and potentially use these as targets. but I think that it is helpful just to kind of visualize what these things look like in the ground. So ideally, what we'd love to see is part of the recommended next steps, kind of a broken record on this, but to update the core sediment management plan to incorporate gravel storage targets and hopefully active bar area, because we think that it is measurable and repeatable as a metric, so that we can track changes in geomorphic form and processes for the program. And that it's pretty easy to do this. We can do this on like a 5-year rotation, because we don't want to do this every year, but after significant geomorphic events or rehab projects. And it's pretty cheap, at roughly $35,000 every 5 years. So it's a pretty easy, cheap, and repeatable thing to do. We have much better technology on how to do this now than we did back in 2014. And that we could use with the physical work group if we can kind of revisit or visit this and develop some targets for the program, that we can use those for future targets for tracking things. So that's it. I don't know if there's any time for any questions. I tried to speed it up a little bit. Hopefully it wasn't too fast.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Scott. We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions.
James, looks like you had your hand raised.
Yeah, hi, Scott. So your last slide, you were talking about assessing storage targets. So what are your, how would we assess gravel storage targets? Are you talking about comparing gravel reaches with a certain amount of gravel storage to capacity? Is that essentially it, or it's interesting to me. This whole thing was really interesting. I really appreciate it. But man, I'm hitting on this, how to assess the storage targets. What are your thoughts on that?
So we're trying to come up with some metric that we can use that's an index of storage. And because we don't know what the bottom of our bucket of gravel is, if it's sitting in a bar, we've tried to simplify it to just plan form area with this active bar area. And so in this chart here, this black line represents existing conditions. Sure. And we've made a first crack at 4 active bar areas. So these are plan form areas per 1,000 meters of channel. And we've made some, I guess, our professional judgment, initial recommendations for scrutiny by the physical work group or anyone else of maybe a better, more aspirational target than what we have out there is just dandy. And so these ranges of values here, this would potentially be a new target for these different subreaches if the physical work group in the program kind of thought that this had merit. And that we could then do management actions like, channel rehab projects, gravel augmentation, particularly in the upper river, roughness features to increase storage, to make better use of the material that's routing through the channel now, and potentially some other mechanisms to bring these black lines up into kind of the range of what we'd like to see in these different subreaches.
Right. And I guess that's so I appreciate the challenge of setting those targets, and I really like where you're going with it, but that's what I'm kind of stumped is how, I guess, is it kind of something that we're just going to have to get a sense for, or is there something more quantitative for assessing whether these targets are the right ones? That's all. And I think maybe that's just a tough one that we're going to have to keep working on.
Well, that's the $90 zillion question. And so the problem, I guess the way that I've looked at this is if you don't try, the status quo will remain. And I hate the status quo. So what we're trying to do here is throw some ideas out for the group to respond to. And what we've done as an idea is we've looked at reaches like in the Browns Canyon reach, is looking at this again, this is more professional judgment, but looking at this and saying, is this reasonable to expect if we did proactive management actions, say in the subreach 4, with additional roughness features or augmentation or more, meanders with rehab projects, and use that as maybe a lower limit for the range, but also try to be a little bit aspirational to maybe even do a little bit better. So then the other thing that we did that's not shown on this table here is that we've taken these range of numbers and we've run them through these relationships to make some predictions of how much additional increases in fry and pre-smolt rearing habitat you would get with these potential targets here, if we chose to do that as percentages over existing habitat values. So at least you can, it's kind of like the tail wagging the dog a little bit. Those habitat predictions aren't driving the active bar area targets. It's kind of like saying, okay, from a geomorphic perspective, here's some potential targets and how does that translate into habitat? But that's something that we could work on. We just kind of need to work with the group to do that.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm really looking forward to seeing where this leads. So thanks a lot, Scott. Yeah.
All right, Kyle, I see your hand up, but we're out of time. So if we have time at the end, we can see if we can get back to you. So let's go ahead and move on. Next on the list, we're going back to Todd, who is going to be talking about the tributary deltas.
Thanks, Scott. That was really great. I kept trying to figure out how to raise my hand, but I didn't pull it off. I'll follow up with you. Some questions I have later. It was great. Let's see here. Okay, so this is a project trying to get at the dynamics occurring post-dam on the Trinity River at the junctions of Rush and Indian Creeks. We focus on tributary junctions because they're hotspots for biological activity, both for salmon and a number of other organisms that are in the freshwater biome that we call streams. And so I'm not going to read this below here. I put this here so that when this presentation on the website, someone knows what's going on. This is a plan that's been submitted for publication in the journal Ecohydrology, is currently under review. So here are the study areas. Rush Creek is the first major tributary downstream of Lewiston Dam. And then the next one would be Grass Valley Creek, and then Indian Creek, which is the other delta or junction area that we've studied in this paper. We skip Grass Valley Creek. It doesn't have a delta really anymore because it has ponds capturing all the sediment that would otherwise form a delta. We wanted to stay close to Lewiston Dam because we wanted to see what the effects of flow regulation, sediment augmentations, bedload transport, and then the evolution of the riparian system on the habitats and functionality and dynamics of these junction areas. You can see they're very different. A and B figures show Rush Creek Delta. The delta area is defined as the extent of flow modeled at 623 cubic meters per second. So we just traced the line around the extent of discharge, and we called that the valley area. And the Indian Creek, you can see it here too, and it worked out pretty well where the valley area is bound and on the, let's see, facing downstream on the left on the base of large dredger piles at Rush, and then at the base of the highway at Indian. And then on the right bank, the base of the hillside at both locations. The A to B lines are a cross section of the valley areas. Rush Creek valley is shown down here. You can see the black is the area inundated by, or the extent of that discharge I mentioned. And so the valley at Rush is about twice as wide as the valley at Indian Creek. So the project is also to see how valley level controls influence the dynamics in these areas. So here's how the valleys fall out. The maximum valley width at Rush is, like I say, about twice that at Indian Creek. The valley back up at Rush Creek is defined from the upstream edge of the delta lobe. So the lobe of sediment that's deposited by Rush Creek, it's from the upstream edge of that downstream to where the valley narrows notably. And then at Indian Creek, it was a little more difficult to define the valley length because there's just really not much of a valley. It's pretty narrow in there. It's constrained by the highway and the hillside. But we chose to go from just upstream of the delta lobe that forms in high water years downstream to where the river valley starts to widen. So back to the attributes of these two valley areas, you can see at these various model discharges, the wetted areas are 2 to 3 times higher at Rush Creek confluence than they are in Creek. And also the energy slope is slightly higher at Indian Creek than Rush Creek. And that represents the confinement by the highway and the hillside at Indian Creek relative to Rush Creek. It's also shown in the grain size differences between these two locations, where the median particle size on the bed and in the subsurface domain is slightly coarser at Indian Creek than Rush Creek, which you would expect from the higher slope at the Indian Creek Valley. So trying to figure out how the flows changed through the period, which was 1960, the year of dam closure, through 2020. Took a look at the very, very fortunate to have 100 and some odd year annual record of flood. Flood was about 525 cubic meters per second. And then once Trinity Dam closed and the reservoir behind it started filling, the and flood was decreased all the way to about 72 cubic meters per second. You can see the I mean, there was a to decrease flooding or more at Lewiston flow regulation in the 1961 to 1980 period. As mentioned before, in the previous talk, the salmon population started to decline, so impetus was for increased flows to try to reverse that decline. You can see through these different periods and offer under the rod, which is observed average annual water volume of about 76,000 hectare meters. So that's quite a lot more than 29,637. That's supposed to be a period in the 1961 and 1980 period. So looking at daily average flow duration curve for each of these different periods, you can see how the unregulated flows were robust in comparison to the first regulatory period, and then the second, third, and then the current regular Am I back?
Yeah, we got you now, Todd.
Got it. Okay, so I don't know where you lost me, but you can see how through time the flows have increased in the study areas. The black line being at Limekiln Gulch, just upstream of Creek. So we use photogrammetry to do our analysis. We're basically tracing the active channel, active bars, and delta areas. Active channel is defined as was defined earlier by Scott. And then you have the wetted area, which is part of the active channel area, obviously. And then you have the delta area, and that's the deposit connected to the tributary creek, and that is contiguous. So within the delta area and the bars, we also measured the increase in vegetation. So if it, in the 2020 photo, you can see how the delta increased progressively to its state here, but then it had this large vegetated area. That's still
Hey, Todd, I don't think we're seeing your screen.
Oh, that's not good.
No screen, distorted audio.
I'm distorted.
We see it now.
Okay. Okay, so anyway, yeah, so this is the 2020 delta. This vegetated area is still called a delta, but it's vegetated. So it's counted in the delta area, but as vegetated area in the analysis. One thing to note here is at dam closure, you have this large point bar, and then almost no bars in the channel otherwise, other than this little guy and some stuff down here. And then with flow regulation, you see the riparian berm come in and flow restricted to a much narrower active channel. But some of these mid-channel bars starting to form some lateral bars, but you also start to see the development of a delta at Rush Creek. And so we'll get into possible explanations for that. But the delta growth is documented here from 2001 to 2020 pretty strongly. But you also have some bar formation as well. So this is the general evolution occurring at Rush Creek. Indian Creek, it's not too different, but just smaller in degree, where you have this large delta area here on the outlet of Indian Creek, a relatively simple channel because the high flows would just pretty much blow it out. And then with flow regulation, you start to see the encroachment of vegetation, the formation of bars because the flows are insufficient to mobilize large amounts of sediment, and then subsequent bar growth through time. So these are the results of the photogrammetry. This is the active channel area, then the bar area, these are active bars, and then the delta area, then the percent of the bar areas that are vegetated, and then the percent of the delta area that's vegetated. And you can see how there is a large change at the junction of the different regulatory periods. So at dam closure, the active channel decreased markedly to a historic low at Rush Creek, which is the filled symbols, and then increased more or less through time to present. Notably, there was a channel reconstruction undertaken at Rush Creek Delta in 1989. That's indicated by the red dot. And then Indian Creek, jumping down to this delta area plot down here, I want to point out that there was a riparian plant removal and channel widening project that occurred in 2007. In terms of the bar area, you can see the large decrease at Rush occurring when that point bar was turned into something of a terrace or maybe a floodplain. It's hard to know under a regulated regime, but just a large decrease in area because of the riparian encroachment. And then the bars never really recovered because the reach is being dominated by delta growth. Conversely, at Indian Creek, you see almost no bar development until more recently, where you have more bars in this reach than occurred the 40 years prior. So we'll talk about that more later. Delta areas at Rush, as I mentioned, it was almost non-existent of a delta in the early days. And then we started to see a progressive increase in the delta deposit. And this is despite 4,500 cubic meters of material being excavated from the delta in 1979 to 1989. And then here's that channel reconstruction project here. There was also some delta excavation at Indian Creek that occurred, I think it was 1979, but just no real formation of a delta at the Indian Creek location due to channel confinement. And so this project that occurred in 2007 at Indian Creek is shown here. This is actually the summer after construction. You can see this was heavily vegetated with riparian plants. Those were largely removed. And then the top portion of the bank was scalped back. The intent was to promote channel widening and bar development. And then that wandering main stem channel, this is the year before, or the aerial photograph that's available before the channel construction. And then here's the year after it was constructed, 1990. And then this general form persisted until 2000 or through 2005. And then in 2006, the highest peak flow on the river since 1974 occurred and just blew that wandering channel out and reformed a new channel path that has led to delta growth to the current record size that occurs in this area. So why did some of these trajectories change occur? So we looked into sediment contributions to the delta areas. First, looking at gravel additions that have been made to the Trinity River and internet becoming unstable. Anyway, these dots is a augmentation activity. And then, so the travel is from these augmentation locations to the Rush Creek is pretty short. So probably a sizable contribution of this sediment to that area. Then is a bit further downstream, travel distance required for that sediment to delta. So who knows how much of this actually contributing to bar growth and delta size at Indian Creek currently. So to get at that, we developed an index of sediment supply to each of these different valley areas. We had to call this an index because it's certainly not an accurate estimate. It's more of a ballpark estimate of what might be contributed to these areas. The approach we took was using the available spring flow sediment monitoring data, computing thresholds of transport, and then using calculations of discharge above that threshold to compute loads, annual loads, and relate those to the annual flow at each of the locations. You can see up here that the annual bed load at the 3 monitoring sites, one at Lewiston, one at Limekiln Gulch, one at Douglas City, it's not always higher at Douglas City. Sometimes it's higher at Limekiln Gulch, and the dots are all kind of mixed up, but they're almost all within an order of magnitude of one another, and they're pretty strongly related to annual flow. Less so at the tributaries. There's a paucity of bedload transport data there that was collected in the late 90s and early 2000s. Nonetheless, we use these power curves of annual bedload to annual flow to provide these indexes. Here's the index for main stem transport, and then tributary transport, and then the sum of those two. And you can see that Indian Creek receives a larger amount of sediment through all the regulatory periods than Rush Creek. And then the cumulative at Indian Creek has been about half an order of magnitude higher at Indian Creek. But we see some of that in these measurements, where the bar area is increasing slightly at Indian Creek. It could be because of increased supply. It could be from some channel widening that's occurred there. It could be from both. Same thing with the Delta area at Rush Creek. We see sizable increases in the Delta, but we don't see any increases on Indian Creek. And we'll look at some aerial photographs here in a sec to try to explain that. Also looked at riparian plant composition at the tributary junctions, both in an aerial manner, but also more importantly to channel migration and widening and width adjustments is just the vegetation type that's on the channel margin, which is shown here, where at Rush Creek, most of the banks are vegetated with woody trees, and almost all the banks at Indian Creek are vegetated with woody trees, but there is notably some areas across from Rush Creek Delta that are unvegetated, or they just have herbaceous plants or grasses that offer relatively weak resistance to bank retreat and erosion compared to the woody trees. So that's something that we looked at is what's the mechanism, one of the mechanisms here for this bar growth and delta growth at these two locations. And it doesn't appear to be that riparian vegetation has much role in that. So here on the left is the Rush Creek Valley. You see the delta. The white line, this is the trace made in AutoCAD for aerial measurements. And the red line is measured, these features measured in 2020. I show these lines for the 2010 imagery, and you can see the vegetated bank in 2010 was clearly wiped out by the channel migrating out to this point here. And that migration and widening was a function of this deposit forming. So it was delta growth because this is, although this would be classified as a bar, it's associated with the delta. So it's a forcing mechanism overcoming the root strength of riparian trees to widen the channel. And we see the same thing here at Indian Creek, where the 2008 channel, which is the channel photograph the year after riparian veg removal, widening only after we see the mid-channel bar growth in the direction of the left bank. So in the absence of a forcing mechanism, you don't see channel adjustments that lead to bar growth. You need the forcing mechanism for sediment deposition to impart increased shear stress on the bed and the banks, local to the banks, to cause this erosion and the bar development. So is it more one or the other? I don't know. But it seems to be both working in concert. But if you have anything other than the tool in your toolbox, other than to add a forcing mechanism, I would do that before I would strip the banks of veg, because it seems the forcing mechanism has more power to cause these adjustments, whether the banks are vegetated with woody material and trees or are compared to herbaceous plants or unvegetated. So we see the channel at Rush Creek expanding in the southeasterly direction, principally by delta growth. We see the channel at Indian Creek increasing primarily by mid-channel bar growth downstream of the delta deposit. So in both cases, we have reduced flows compared to historic. And so it's a combination of those reduced flows, reducing confidence in the channel, and the increased roughness from these enlarging deposits in promoting further deposition. So given those dynamics occurring at these locations, we wanted to see whether the wide valley at Rush Creek or the relatively narrow valley at Indian Creek would be able to produce higher capacity for rearing Chinook fry. And for this, we used Samet Al's capacity model and with SRH2D predictions of channel hydraulics. And we found that the percentile of capacity per 10th of a river kilometer is significantly higher at Rush Creek than Indian Creek, certainly, but also higher at Rush Creek than, depending on flow, 60 to about 98% of the rest of the Trinity River restoration reach. So this agrees with prior work that the tributary junctions are hotspots for biological activity. That is certainly the case at Rush Creek. It's less of the case at Indian Creek, and we argue, that's due to channel confinement, providing fewer degrees of freedom for channel change and complexity to be generated for fish habitat. So just in terms of raw numbers, the normalized capacity is ranging from about 250,000 to about 800,000 at Rush, but is relatively flat in Indian Creek at about that 250,000 to about 300,000 at the range of discharges modeled. So why is that? Principally because with increases in flow at Indian Creek, you have these exceed what the juveniles seek for habitat compared to Rush Creek Valley, where you've got a flatter valley, I guess you could say, for the flow to spread on and create habitat at higher flows. So the conclusions: the wide valley at Rush Creek exhibited larger impacts from damming than the narrow valley at Indian Creek, yet recovered to a more functional state for juvenile Chinook as regulated flows and sediment supplies increased to the regulatory periods. So this suggests that unconfined reaches may be susceptible to change when a river is dammed, but they also provide the greatest opportunity for restoration after damming. Channel forcing is more important for causing bank deformation than riparian plant composition, as we've observed in these study areas. So absent a forcing element that's sized to the channel, bank retreat did not occur even where vegetation was absent in these areas. So the sediment removal from the Rush Creek Delta didn't really affect its size. The construction of the meandering channel, though, in 1989 probably reduced competence of the river there and aided delta expansion. And the delta continued to enlarge through 2020 and maybe capturing bed load and suppressing local downstream bar development. So when you're doing your active bar analysis, maybe in the future, you'd consider deltas as active bars because they seem to function similarly. So removing riparian plants to promote channel winding and taking the top off the banks didn't really affect the active channel bar or delta areas at Indian Creek. And that's not to say that method wouldn't work elsewhere, but this may have resulted from channel restriction and higher slope in this particular valley that is relatively narrow compared to Rush Creek Valley, certainly. So the Trinity River has evolved at Rush to a state that generates significantly higher capacity for Chinook fry than Indian Creek and most of the rest of Restoration Reach. The function that's most responsible for this is active channel expansion from delta growth. And delta growth in turn seems to have been promoted by reduced flow competence, by the decreased floods, and the increase in sediment supply from augmentations in just main stem sediment transport. Lastly, expansion of the Rush Creek Delta does not appear to be restricting bedload routing through the backwater pool upstream of the Delta. And we came at this by differencing the 2003 and 2016 bathymetric surveys of the pool, which showed almost no change in volume. But a big caveat of this is the 2003 survey was at a much lower density than the 2016. So this would have to be revisited if we get a chance to resurvey the channel in 2022 to get confident in this type of a result. And that's all I have.
All right, thanks, Todd. We won't have time for questions for this. So if you do have questions for Todd, you can reach out to him after, you can type them in the chat. And if we have time at the end, we can address them. But I wanted to go ahead and move on to Justin now, who is going to be talking about channel complexity.
There, my unmute disappeared. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, we see it,
Yep.
Justin.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm talking about the channel complexity synthesis. This got kicked off at the same time as a lot of these other ones back in that original batch. It was put forward by Robert Franklin, and his idea was to get a whole bunch of program partners and then some other folks from outside of our usual suspects and bring them all together and see if we could get a handle on a definition of what channel complexity is and how it can inform the program, because it's definitely a recurring theme throughout the program's history. So the goal of this report was to look at all of the documents and see where channel complexity had been brought up before. As I said, it's got a long history with the program, and it's popped up in everything from the Trinity River Flow Evaluation Study, and then the Integrated Assessment Plan, the Integrated Habitat Assessment, the TRRP Backgrounder. More recently, it showed its face again in the Phase 1 review and the paper by Beachy and Pest that looked at habitat carrying capacity and the possibility of what we can actually make through our rehabilitation actions. And so once we look through all of those documents, we can sort of summarize how it's been used and if it's been set as a process by which to achieve a goal or a goal in and of itself, and as we dug through, what we really found is that channel complexity is desirable but undefinable, because even though it's scattered throughout all of these documents, there's really only one instance where somebody says this is what channel complexity is. Instead, it's just a complex channel is a desirable attribute of a river system that will help promote juvenile fish growth and recover the fish population. There were a couple of instances where we did try to have that defined in a more real way using numerical models. The integrated assessment, habitat assessment plan back in 2015, that came out in 2015. We used single regression analyses to look at physical habitat and how it related to traits that were measured, such as the active bar area that Scott talked about, or channel edge length, or channel width, or some relationship between the two. But we really never got that off the ground in any sort of meaningful way. And where a lot of these efforts arrived, and we ended up in our group that has been working on this arrived similarly, is that when you're talking about channel complexity, that's really too simple of a term, because there was so much focus on the wedge channel and the topography therein that doesn't really get at what it is that we're trying to get a handle on. In the flow study, they gave a very simple definition and started out with what channel complexity is not. I'm sure the majority of you are very familiar with the story of the river is a very simple trapezoidal channel, and as you increase flows, you reduce the slow, shallow habitat that juvenile fish enjoy. And so the antithesis of that, or at least as a first cut that the flow study promoted, was an alternating bar sequence. It was still primarily a single thread channel, but it would provide a range of velocity, depth, and topographic diversity that would allow more habitat across a range of flows. The time back when I actually got to go out in the field on a regular basis, that this really hit home for me was doing the habitat mapping at Loudon Meadows pre-construction. And the way the habitat mapping used to work, if you're unfamiliar, is we would go out and we take a GPS point on the bank, and then you work your way out into the channel a little ways, and you find the edge of cover and the outside edge of your fry habitat, which is about 2 feet deep, and the outside edge of your pre-smolt habitat, which is about 3 feet deep, or until it gets too fast. And it was real easy to navigate these banks, especially up in here at 300 and 450 CFS, and 750 it wasn't so bad. But when we were at 2000, all of us were in dry suits. It was darn challenging to keep the boat anchored in the middle of the channel because the velocities were so fast. And I'm not a short individual, I'm over 6 feet tall, and the standing in the edge of the water next to the dry bank, the terrace was over my head. And so when we were mapping at 2000 CFS, what we would do is we'd jump in the water with our flow meter, and then you'd grab onto some willows, and the velocities were so fast that you'd get swung downstream and slammed into the branches downstream of you. And then the person in the boat would shoot you with a laser rangefinder, and you would be the outside edge of cover, and you'd also be the outside edge if it was shallow enough for any habitat, because all the velocities in the brush were real low. But as soon as you went outside of that brush line, it was just ripping fast. Once they did the construction, it was much easier to navigate this because a whole bunch of flow came through the side channel and it had more room to spread out. And so just intuitively looking at those two images, you can see that one is more complex and better for fish than the other, but it still doesn't get at that, the Zen question of what is a complex channel. And in the founding documents, we talked about there was a lot of things that the flow study didn't address. They didn't really talk about the role of large wood. We have a lot more side channels than were ever envisioned in the rod or in the flow study. We use a lot more alcoves and some other things that have been developed through time. And despite all of these developments and explanations of what they are, channel complexity, we still haven't figured out what that magic bullet is that's going to make the fishery get recovered. In one study where Buffington was actually tried to quantify it, and he had this unitless measure of edge length, which is very highly correlated with physical habitat for juvenile fish divided by the wetted channel area. But that didn't really click on either. It didn't stick. But in his discussion and also in the Beachy and Pest paper that I mentioned earlier, they have this sort of broader context, and this was the illustration that they put. And so the corridor, rather than the channel, was the direction that our group ended up going, because we don't want just diverse topography within the wetted area, but really corridor complexity is what we're after. It's supposed to be an indicator of a healthy river system, and so we need to have built into whatever metric we are using to evaluate the stream, the riparian corridor, and how wide is it? Is it a riparian berm that's right against a low flow channel, or is it actually a healthy riparian forest that covers the entire floodplain? How are the nutrients flowing or not flowing in the channel? In that initial Loudon example, the river was, or the bar is perched so high above the river that it takes a lot of water in order to inundate and bring all those lochliness inputs into the channel and start bug production and those sorts of things. And so it's not just a static thing, but also the flux of energy and the flux of nutrients and the things like shear stress, and how all of these things are going to incorporate that need to be tied into our corridor complexity metric that everybody seems to want. The 2009 backgrounders started down this path where they had a whole host of inputs that all fed into what we were trying to achieve, which is fish populations and a healthy riparian system and a happy place for frogs and turtles. But beyond some conceptual models, it didn't really take off either. And so, unfortunately, we have not completed this synthesis report, but we have made quite a bit of progress on it. And this table here is where we've landed to date. So we know what it is that we want to have incorporated in there. We have the people in hand that are knowledgeable about each of these ideas and concepts. And now it's just a matter of framing it into something that will be usable into the future. And so we get at some of those, that top category of matter and energy flux, how things flow throughout a river corridor, and then also the more static things, at least temporarily in time, the topography and cross sections and where things are located on a planar map. And then how we expect these things to evolve through time, and so that we can measure those and make sure our trajectory is going in the right direction. And so yeah, that's where we landed now. I realize that's a fairly generic overview, but it's also almost 3 o'clock. So I might have more time for one question.
Justin, this is Scott. I just had one maybe comment on that last slide, if you can kind of go back to it. I think one of the big strides that the group made, at least for me anyways, was this idea of more than just structural complexity, that the functional complexity was just as important or maybe more important than the structural complexity. So it kind of brought it to an equal tier with the structural complexity, the physical features. So I think that's a contribution that's going to be really valuable to the program once we finish this up.
Justin, this is Todd. I wonder if you think this will be able to be wrapped up. This is kind of like the complexity Bible that it's turning into be. Do you think that this will be brought to a state that's applicable and useful?
So yes, I mean, as I said at the beginning, this was kicked off by Robert Franklin, and then it got going and he retired. And then our group was some folks out of the McBain shop. So it was John and Scott and Smokey and Andrew Hilton. And then we had Connor Shea and Nick Somm from the service, and Tom Lyle from Stillwater, and then Jenny Curtis from USGS, who's also done some Trinity work. And we essentially, it was some personnel turnover and that lost momentum initially, and then we were prioritizing other reports to try to push them out the door. But I'd say it's at least 3/4 of the way there. So I don't think it's going to be much longer before we should be able to get it to a usable state. And I agree, it will be a useful thing once we complete it.
Hey, Justin, this is Dave. Yeah, I was just wondering, looking at this, how far along you were into this thing. It seems like it's near the beginning to me, but I think there's a lot of work that's been done that you're maybe not aware of, and and just from what you reviewed, because most of this was kind of reviewing other stuff. So anyway, there is more stuff that's been done.
And there's been more stuff since we sort of hadn't, I guess, since this has been left, there has been more stuff done. Things like the Deep Gulch Sheridan the post-construction review that you were doing. I think some of that stuff could be informative, and that was done after we had left this. But yeah, there are other documents, and I just sort of touched on the cursory ones.
Yeah, well, and particularly just this slide, it's titled River Corridor Complexity, and there is that, I think it's a 2015 big report, River Corridor thing, that really takes up that whole question of what is complexity, and pretty heavily.
All right, well, it's just after 3. We're only supposed to go till 3. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Justin or any of the other authors. Otherwise, we will have our next session next Thursday, the 18th from 1 to 3 p.m. And that will be related to riparian issues. So thanks a lot, everyone, for joining in, and we'll hopefully see you next week.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our presenters, too. You guys did a great job.
Yeah, especially them.
Thank you, everyone.
Guys.